bringing everyone here. So thank you very much for, I'll bring everyone. So I'll start inviting people. So thank you very much for being here. Before I start, I want to thank the organizers, want to thank Dubai Cares for this invitation to the Reward Conference, for the very strong lights that allow me to see the public. And I think, I mean, behind all the discussions that we have about how to improve the quality of learning is how do we make sure that we are collectively devoting the right amount of resources to our education systems. So to have a discussion around that, I would like to start inviting to the stage a distinguished panel that we have today with us. So first, let me start with Alicia Herbert. Thank you very much, Alicia. So Alicia is Director of the Education, Gender and Equality Directorate at FCDO. And she's also FCDO's Special Envoy for Gender Equality and head of Abercrombie House, which is FCDO headquarters in Scotland. Next, let me invite Caitlin Barron. Caitlin is the founder and CEO at the Luminos Fund, an education nonprofit dedicated to giving the world's most vulnerable out-of-school children a second chance to learn. Then invite my friend Gwen Hines, who's here with us. Gwen is CEO of Save the Children UK. She has worked in international development for 20 years, most recently as International Programs Director at the FID, now FCDO. And she was also UK Executive Director at the World Bank Group, where I had the pleasure of meeting her. Then we have our two next panelists are Your Excellency, Minister of Technical and Higher Education of the Republic of Sierra Leone, Professor Alpha Wurie. Let me see, Professor, great to have you here. Professor Wurie has been Minister of Education before for about 6 years, if I'm not wrong. Then he was Minister of Health in a very complicated moment for Sierra Leone. And now he's Minister of Higher Education of Sierra Leone, and he's still with us alive and kicking. So, which is really surprising, I mean, having 3 ministerial posts. So a lot of experience of Professor Wurie. And finally, we have Your Excellency, the Minister of Finance of Tanzania, Mwigulu Nchemba. So let me see. Minister, thank you very much for joining us. So, can someone help me with you? Please. So we're living a learning crisis, as we were discussing yesterday during several panels. The pre-COVID, this discussion would have started would have happened in December 2019. We were already saying we're living a learning crisis. We have more than half of kids in low and middle income countries that do not have the fundamental skills of being able to write, to read and understand a simple text. Our projections are showing that those numbers might increase now, and the situation will be much more complicated. We were in a world of large inequality of opportunities before this pandemic, and now we know that this pandemic is impacting more the vulnerable, more the younger children, more those kids in younger grades. And this pandemic might have a gigantic impact on this generation, so creating a large intergenerational inequality of opportunities. So in that context, we have seen that most countries have implemented large economic recovery packages, which are absolutely needed in order to fight the recession that we had in 2020. There is some recovery now in 2021 in many countries. But if we look at the details of the structure of those economic recovery packages, unfortunately, on average, less than 3% has been devoted to education. And actually, that 3% is an average that is much larger, is about 7 or 8% in richer countries, and it's much lower than that 3% in middle-income countries and poorer countries. So actually, we are facing a very, very tough situation in terms of budgets that are going to education. The last data that we had around March of this year was showing us that about 2/3 of the countries were either keeping or reducing slightly their budgets to education. But we don't have data more recent of budgets. And hopefully that situation is turning around. And why it is critical to turn it around, because given the evidence that we see of this somewhat silent crisis on education, right, the recovery is not going to be for free. The recovery requires implementing very specific and very well-crafted and complex learning recovery packages that will allow us to make sure that we save this generation. But most likely, does that not come for free? That will imply that every dollar should count, that we should be much more efficient in expenditures, and most likely many countries will require additional expenditures across the whole cycle of education, from early childhood education to tertiary education, right? And if we go to the extremes, early childhood education basically disappeared from most of our education systems during the last 18 months, despite the fact that we have always been saying, with the evidence that exists, that early childhood education has the highest private and social return, right? Is the most important investment. Well, that most important investment disappeared. If we go to higher education, I mean, it is true. In higher education, more institutions were able to connect with their students via remote learning in many parts of the world. But still we see, for instance, that many kids that now are entering higher education, so that their last years of secondary education during the pandemic require a lot of remedial education. We see a lot of evidence of that, of people who are receiving kids in higher education and say, look, these kids do not have the same skills that usually they have, right? And we need to compensate for that. So that's an additional task for higher education institutions and for technical institutions. So this is a critical juncture. This is a very complicated juncture, and we need to find ways to address it creatively. So to reflect on that, let me try to get some ideas, right, and creative and innovative ideas from our panel. Let me start with you, Gwen. Save the Children recently published a new report called Build Forward Better, which includes new analysis of the national education systems most at risk from different crises. And can you give us a flavor of the findings and recommendations, particularly regarding how to reform education financing?
Thanks so much, Jaime, and hello to everybody. And I think just listening to the sessions over the last 2 days, there are so many common themes coming through. And I think this point today on financing is so important. And just recognizing that education must be a vital part of COVID recovery. As the World Bank report says, 17 trillion in lost investment if we don't start investing urgently in education as part of the COVID recovery. So our report is called Build Forward Better, not Build Back Better, and that's very deliberate, because as you say, Jaime, even before COVID, we had a learning crisis. So we need to stem the losses today. So every day that schools are shut around the world, we're getting more and more losses. We've got kids who've never been to school. We need to catch up what we've lost. We need to build forward better and be honest with ourselves about where education was letting children down. Tens of millions of children who've never been to school, who were out of school, and help those children to get into school and to get a decent education. And then we also need to think about a better education going forward, so the quality of learning. And tech is part of that, but really putting children and teachers at the center of that quality learning of foundational skills. And lastly, around resilience. So this is not the last pandemic, sadly. And we think of it in terms of COVID, conflict, and climate change. Some countries are struggling with all three, and for them it's particularly difficult. But whether it's keeping children in schools safe, in conflict, in violence, whether it's coping with droughts, floods, shocks, or conflicts, making sure that we build in that resilience for future so that never again do we see this kind of reversal we have, and particularly, as I say, focusing on those who are being left behind, because the one thing this pandemic has shown is that inequality underpins our systems and our whole global structure, and it's those being left behind who've struggled most. So investing in the children out of school being left behind actually helps to make every country and the world much more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gwen. And as you say, the issue of equity, right, is absolutely fundamental in terms of our challenges now. Let me turn now to Alicia. Following up on what Gwen was discussing, what do you see in terms of these challenges regarding how to finance all this huge task that we have? How do you see ODA playing a role in the coming few, usually I would say in the coming few years, but given the urgencies, right, we're not now talking about in the next few months, right? How do you see, not only from the perspective of UK, but in general, how do you see the ODA patterns, the overseas development assistance, the international support? What are the patterns that you're seeing? No. Can someone help with Alicia's sound?
Okay, you can hear me now? Yes.
Okay.
I think I'm on now. Thank you very much.
Should we pass it down?
No, it's not. Maybe if someone can give a mic, just in case that we have it as a backup. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much. I don't seem to have very much of a voice today, because I'm not sure this is working either. But anyway, I'll persist.
Closer.
So thank you very much for that, Jaime. And I think just before I get into sort of the forward look, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's happened over the course of the past 2 decades with respect to ODA, so Overseas Development Assistance. And 2 observations, really. One of them around what's happened in relation to economic growth, and then another in relation to school numbers. So we know that we've had quite significant economic growth, particularly in low and middle-income countries over the course of the past 2 decades. And what it has translated into is almost a kind of 6-fold increase in expenditure in education, from about 200 billion in 2000 to about 1.2 trillion today. Meanwhile, what has happened with ODA over that period, we've gone from about 5 to 15 billion. So relatively less important for many of our partners. So that's the first thing in terms of economic growth. The second, in terms of school numbers, we've got an unprecedented number, at least before COVID, and we're still working through the impact of that, about 200 million more school-age children in school in low-income countries. And indeed, as well, we know that, at least at primary level, that access and enrollment had actually increased quite significantly. So if we take those 2 in terms of what's happening with respect to the expenditure in education by governments, national governments, vis-a-vis ODA, as well as what's happening with the school numbers, ODA is spread more thinly. So what do we do with the relatively scarce resources, or fewer resources relative to what's happening with respect to in partner countries? So I would say a few things. We need to now step back and think about how we get maximum impact from the ODA that is being spent. So just a few ideas about how that can be done. First, in terms of targeting Where are we targeting our support? Where are we targeting that ODA? We know that, for example, almost as much goes to upper middle income countries as it does to low income countries. That's not only an issue of equity, but it's also an issue of impact. And I would suggest that we pivot to support low income countries where in many instances there is huge commitment to education, but many times there's a shortfall of resourcing. And we know as well in emergency settings, in humanitarian settings, that in many instances that donors are the educators of last resort. A second area around impact is around effectiveness. And the Global Education Advisory Panel recently put out a report on best buys, and that gave some sense of where should we invest? What are the best buys out there in terms of education? And indeed, they found that almost half of the programs showed no positive impact on learning outcomes, while 20% of the most effective were had 9 times a greater impact than the average. So it gives us some kind of guide as to where we should finance. So, that's an important reference point. A third area in terms of impact could be around where do donors actually fall behind the political will and political commitment of our partner governments as well. So I would say, with those relatively scarce resources, let's go for impact. That would be the first thing. But beyond the impact piece, which is hugely important, of course, we know that there's still a financing gap out there. And indeed, the Learning Generation report indicated that we would need about 40 billion by 2030 of development assistance, which would be a quadrupling of what we do right now. I think that's a pretty tough gig in this current economic environment. So I would suggest, or indeed strongly suggest, that we need to make whatever we do now and in the future work even harder and look at more innovative approaches to the way in which we do it. How do we use sovereign guarantees? How do we use results-based financing to draw in, for example, a whole range of other donors and a whole range of other partners into the education sector? So impact, and then to do things differently in terms of, the expenditure going forward and ODA going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. So it's great that you put the two things together. We need to spend more, but we need to make sure that this is done in an impactful way and that those dollars are effective. And thanks for mentioning the Global Education Advisory Panel. That precisely is an extremely interesting initiative that was spearheaded by FCDO and the World Bank that is to identify smart buys. So not things that work, but things that work and are also cost effective. And surprisingly, in that report, one thing that it said that, no, this doesn't work is textbooks. And people will say, well, how can textbooks not work, right? Obviously, you need textbooks in the schools, right? Well, they don't work. The problem is that they don't work on their own. If the only thing that you do is buy textbooks and you just put them there, that does not translate into learning if it's not part, right, of a package that is a textbooks that has the right curriculum, that is adapted to the needs of the child, and that the teachers, right, have the right skills and the right preparation in order to use those textbooks effectively. So that's why textbooks on its own, they might have zero impact. Right, so that's where this effectiveness issue that Alicia was mentioning is so important. But the other thing that you were mentioning is how to complement ODA, make it more impactful. But that's something that has to happen as part of the national endeavors, right? Part of the national plans. And with that, I would like to turn to Minister Nchemba from Tanzania. Thank you for being there. And it's great when we have ministers of finance who are in education summits, right, and really worried about, how to be more impactful and more effective in terms of the dollars that you put in education. And so I wanted to ask you, given the challenge that we have, that we need to, at the end of the day, what in every country, we need to finance a minimum package for each child. Right, to make sure that each children at the end of the day eventually will have the right quality education. That is many cases more than what national budgets can afford. So how do you see the possibility of complementing, how to put together the need of increasing domestic resource mobilization, and at the same time increasing overseas development assistance. So the national resources and the international resources, how can they complement each other in order to allow you to achieve, right, the results that you need?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity on the agenda on the table. Yeah, and then foremost, I wish to appreciate the partnership which has been granted on education. And as it was said in the previous presentation, that the education agenda is not go alone, and we cannot, each country decide to go alone and succeed. That the joint efforts is highly recommended and needed. And on your question on how we can complement the two efforts, the first and foremost is basing on a decision that we have all to decide and believe that the success to all other subsectors, the icon should be on education. And once we name it and make it as a campaign tool to everybody to understand that once we in focus of getting achievement on other subsectors, then the frontline agenda item should be on education. And how we can make it in that way. Should you expect it to have a budget cut on other sectors, mention it be health, mention it be family planning, then it has to start with education. For instance, if you are to succeed in family planning, the first thing you have to do is to make sure that you have a great percentage of all the number of girls maintained at school for a number of years, starting from the lower education to higher education. Because if you leave them hanging in the streets, out of schools and the like, that you will be literally generating potential mothers within the period they could have been in school. So even family planning should have to start with investing in education. Even budget cuts in the side of health and the like, it should start with investing in education. So what we have been doing on our case, and thanks to all other development partners, that is the joint effort we have been saying, we have so far worked with multi-donors and various programs, starting with the education strategy, in which we have multi-donors inside it, with COICA, with CEDA, with GPE, just to mention a few, but led with the World Bank, famously known in Swahili language, Benki ya Dunia. We have done it starting from the lower levels, the primary education, and in the near future we will also be signing a new project on boosting learning environment in primary education. We have the SEQUIP that was also targeted on quality improvement on secondary education. And we thought it should have some connectivity in where we have also the other arm on higher learning for economic transformation, where we have to gather all the efforts which have been successfully administered in the lower levels, transformed in the higher learning. And nevertheless, we are also looking forward to see how we can have the other alternative skill development, that is the vocational training, geared to have achievement in both self-employment and the formal employment in government and private sector. So the joint efforts is primary, and it needs to be strongly supported by both the governments and the donors. For we ministers of finance, though we normally like to see ring fencing finances or budgets allocated to specific priority areas like education, but where we are going with this diversity of requirement with the declining revenues, we need to devote on ring fencing budgets going to education so that we can achieve the targets which have been globally agreed, the 20% and above. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thanks for the ring fencing. Right, that's absolutely critical in this juncture. Let me now turn to Professor Alpha Wurie. You are now Minister of Higher Education, but you have been before Minister of Education, Minister of Health in Sierra Leone, and you were in charge of this ministry following the end of the conflict on 97 and 98, and during several Ebola outbreaks. So you have had your share of shocks. So do this experience offer us learning on innovative financing, on partnerships, and collaboration between national and international partners that you believe that are valuable lessons that we could use today?
First of all, let me thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. And let me express that we are here now because of the disruptions that have occurred as a consequence of the pandemic. But really, disruptions have been going on in several countries. More so in sub-Saharan Africa, wars, civil conflicts. These have resulted in displacement of people within their country, and in some instances of people becoming refugees in other countries as well. So there have been shocks before, and it is good that we are now looking at what is going on. I served as Minister of Education in 1996 at the helm of the war in Sierra Leone between 1991 and 2002. So maybe I'll just express the interventions that occurred then. May I just register here that more often than not, international agencies tend to run away from countries that are described as unstable. And that is the critical time that you require support. May I say, in 1998, 1999, we had great support from the World Bank and the African Development Bank. In fact, it was for the very first time that they put resources together in a basket fund for it to be managed at the same time. The 6 interventions that we did were: 1, to ensure those in the system stay in the system. By that I mean the war itself was as a reflection of weakness in civil service, in the services to the rest of the country. There was already a skew of services. So the bank ensured that we put in 2 primary schools in every chiefdom of Sierra Leone. There were 49 chiefdoms without a junior secondary school. Those 49 chiefdoms had junior secondary schools. Books were bought on just 4 subjects, core subjects: maths, English, science, social studies, and nothing else. This was to bring everybody to basic operational level. And of course, books without teachers, nothing could really happen. So in the formal sector, teachers were also upgraded to meet that. But you're coming from war. People have missed out a couple of years along the line. A program called Complementary Rapid Education for Primary School was done, in which you do 2 years in 1 year. So instead of a 6-year primary school, you reduce that to 3 years for those that have not been going through the formal schooling. You immediately have to look at the young. The war was contributed to by mainly the young. There were child soldiers. These are people that are traumatized. These are people that you have to give some support and help in life. And therefore, some level of technical and vocational education came in which the GIZ, or GTZ it was then, played a major role in providing vocational and technical options. Doing all of this, during war, the women suffer the most. and we had to give a supporting hand. This time, government of Sierra Leone supported women to get back to school. Books, uniform, bag. In the north and the eastern regions, we did a bit more support than the other parts of the country, just to get some level of equity in what is going on. But you want health provisions. So school health started to come in. The warming had to occur. Some level of open malaria tests, because a large number of people that get sick is as a consequence of malaria. That was the time at the end we knew what is the essence of play, what is the essence of game. You know, when people are traumatized, high-density games, volleyball, football, means a lot. But those that, I attended the meeting here yesterday on Think Tank, and somebody was using the Lego in trying to develop the minds. Well, we had to use similar things 30 years ago in getting to get the young to think again. So what I'm saying here, collaboration is vital whenever there is disruptions. And I'm most pleased that we have come out now for us to recognize that we are each other's keeper. In the health sector, when you close your eyes against what is happening in your next door country, it eventually gets to you. Nowadays, with easy flights from one country to the other, you can spread it so rapidly. And therefore, it is critical that whatever is happening in another country, some supporting hand is given. May I say, the situation is very different as at now in the country because of the political will of the existing government. Whilst we are supporting education with 6% of the budget 30 years ago, we're talking about 22% of the budget as I speak now. Whilst we're talking about basic operational support during the period of war, now we're talking about quality, free quality education. Now we are not only talking about girls, we're talking about boys and girls supported right through the system. So major changes are taking place. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for both sharing those lessons of innovative interventions even at that moment, and how that today can really make a change if there is a political will, right, to really invest in making sure that there are equitable opportunities for everyone. And now let me turn to another angle, or to another critical player, which is the private sector and global philanthropy. And let me ask you, Caitlin. So following, we know that private philanthropy is sometimes hesitant in investing in international education. It would be great to hear your thoughts, right, on what do you think that is, right? Because you're the example of being interested in financing education. But what happens with the rest? Why the hesitation of many other players on global philanthropy? What can we do to change that? And what role do you see for private philanthropy to support this urgent learning recovery process that we need to undertake?
Thank you, Jaime. I'm happy to share. When my colleagues and I founded Luminos 6 years ago with the mission to close learning gaps and help out-of-school children get a second chance to learn, we used to have to work really hard to explain to private philanthropists what we did and why. Who are these children who are out of school, and what is actually lost when a child is denied the chance to learn? And if there is one silver lining to this extraordinarily challenging time for the world, is that philanthropists the world over, in a very personal, first-person way, understand what it means when children are denied the chance to go to school. And that for us in the international education opportunity environment is an enormous opportunity, right? So, as we all know, we all hand wring in international education. Why do philanthropists love global health and leave us starving on the sidelines? And the reality is that more often than not, philanthropists are reluctant to jump into education for two main reasons. One, they don't want to start something they feel like they have to fund forever. They want to be able to be there and be out again. And education is something that takes a long time. So that creates reluctance. Number two, they want to fund things that work. And quite often in international education, we focus on what doesn't work. And so both of these things can be enormously discouraging. But here's the opportunity of this moment, right? Nothing about catch-up education is easy. And Gwen can speak to that as well as I can. But it is quick, and it is essential. And the time for investment is now. And if ever there was a moment for a major catalytic private philanthropist to play a game-changing role in our space, that moment is now.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And you're right that this is a crisis that everyone lived, right? Rich and poor, everyone understood what is the impact that school closures can have on education. But still, I think we, as you say, I mean, we need to change some mindsets. And one important thing that you mentioned is that people say, well, changes in education take time, right? Yeah, obviously, to make a gigantic structural change, right, take time. But it's not true that in education, one can see visible changes in a few years, right? If we have a country in sub-Saharan Africa where learning poverty today, right, this percentage of kids who cannot read and understand a simple text. We see countries in Africa, that number is 90%. Well, obviously going from 90 to 10, yes, that will take us some time, true. But that doesn't mean we cannot reduce 20 points, right, in a few years. That can happen, and we have seen those changes. So yes, a complete change will take some time, but visible change can happen in a few years. So we need to take away that idea that, no, in education, everything takes time. Right? If there's political will, visible changes can be seen in the short run. Now, let me start a second round in which probably we'll have just smaller interventions of 1 minute and a half. And I wanted to start going in the same order with you, Alicia. And I haven't heard now from Gwen regarding private philanthropy. There are many players, but we need to work more on private philanthropy, but also during the Global Partnership of Education Summit now recently in July 20, a group of low-income countries endorsed the Kenyatta Declaration to progressively increase, right, their share of domestic resources go into education. So how do you see, again, let me go back to what the Minister of Tanzania was mentioning. How do you see the complementing ODA with this need to increase domestic resource mobilization?
Thank you very much for that, Jaime. And indeed, that commitment from developing country partners to increase their spending on education was one of probably the highlights and one of the huge successes of the Global Education Summit in July. I think that ODA still very, very much has a role to play, and indeed probably more important now than ever. Just 3 points for me. One, that I mentioned just earlier, focus on low-income settings. We think it's hugely important that we do that. Again, in many instances, the political commitment is there, but there's a gap in terms of resourcing, so we should probably focus on that. Secondly, in emergency settings, our colleague from Sierra Leone spoke very eloquently and very powerfully about the situation in Sierra Leone post-conflict and the role of donors and the role of national government working together in order to take that education system to a different place. And therefore, hugely important that we focus on those settings as well. And we know that communities demand education in those particular contexts and in those settings as well. Yes, a very small percentage of humanitarian aid actually goes to education. And then finally, I think that ODA still has an important role to play with respect to the generation of evidence, to the use of evidence, and indeed working with our partner governments in deploying that evidence, as it were, in the policy space as well as in terms of programming. And that's why, for example, just very recently we launched, as the UK government, we launched our What Works Hub. and that at every point, at various points of the education planning process, it will be about the integration of evidence and the integration of what works at that particular point. So focus on the low income, in conflict and crisis, or post-conflict and crisis and protracted settings, and then in the use and generation of evidence as well, is what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. And focusing on this last point that you're making, it's not about quantity, but it's also about quality. It's about the effectiveness of our interventions. So I wanted to turn to Gwen to try to reflect on the issues. Yes, we need to have the right interventions, but we need them at scale, right? So we said, yeah, we can have this fantastic innovation in 20 schools. We say, well, to be frank, I'm not interested in 20 schools. Right? If I'm talking about my country, Peru, I'm interested in the 50,000 schools of Peru. Right? So how can we combine that? Let's do the efficient things, but let's do them at scale.
You're right, Jaime, it's a massive challenge. Think about around the world right now. We're looking at how do we help children in every country catch up the lost learning. So to give you a very short headline, 12 weeks. 12 weeks is what it takes to help children catch up meaningfully in terms of literacy, numeracy, well-being. So Save the Children, working with many other partners, building on lessons from Sierra Leone, other places, whereas the Honourable Minister said there's been a long help children catch up 2 years in one, working with refugee camps, children on the move, migrant settings. We were adapting this model and saying, what can you do in 12 weeks with tailored learning assessments? So it's not just learning as usual, it's tailored learning assessments, it's emotional well-being support as well as really targeted learning. And you see huge results just in those 12 weeks. It doesn't mean they graduate, then children go back into school at a higher level than they would otherwise. And actually, in many cases, they're leapfrogging where they would have been after a year, even 2 years of school. So we're working with investors at the moment, and as you say, Caitlin, this is the kind of thing that private investors, philanthropists are interested in because it's short and it works. And then very much the long term is governments and is domestic financing and is what families themselves do. But this kind of intervention helps you leapfrog that gap that we've got.
Great, thank you very much, Gwen. And let me change a little bit the order and go back, given that reference, go back to Caitlin, and then we'll go to the ministers. So following that, on that experience and those ideas from Save the Children, I know that Luminos has been piloting initiatives where you fund learning outcomes instead of years of schooling, or so more the outcome more instead of the input. So how do you engage with governments, right? And what are the challenges in order to implement this type of scheme, right? Both working with governments and other stakeholders.
Thank you, Jaime. It's a great question. And the reality is that outcomes financing can be hard for governments. But if ever there was an aspect of education that lent itself to this kind of innovation, it would be catch-up learning. So in a very relatively short period of time, you can see a significant payoff. And it's so important in the catch-up learning environment to move away from financing bums in seats and move towards financing shift in learning outcomes. And if there's a powerful wedge in the education sector for shifting our mindsets as a whole about how we finance, we believe catch-up education is the place to start.
Great. So this definitely talks to the focus on the outcome, to focus on learning, right? And independently of what's the set of the menu of policies we choose, let's make sure that we have the right combination such that we move the outcome. Let me turn to our Minister of Higher Education of Sierra Leone. With your broad experience, Minister, in three different ministries, and as we're here to rewire education, I would be interested in hearing from you if you could see innovative financing modalities that can and should be explored to try to increase the efficiency of the resources that we're putting on education.
Let me thank you again, but I think now we should be able to look at education and health. The reason being we have just experienced how health issues can affect everything. And I think that is where the political will comes in again. Because when you have leadership, presidency that stands ahead of the country in its advocacy, in its getting to people to appreciate what possible disaster is around, you get everybody buying in. You know, Sierra Leone was also exposed to Ebola. The 3 Mano River Union countries, 11,000 deaths, but 4,000 from Sierra Leone specifically. And therefore, all the tenets that we learned then, we are able to put back into this corona issue. By that I mean we were able to set in management of the disease, laboratory molecular biology screening, risk management as well. All of those issues. All of those impact on the school. And I'm so pleased to see the Minister of Basic Education here, Dr. David Senge, because he ensured that we're talking now about every child going to school. He ensured that pregnant women can access school now. He ensured that you can use technology for people to get their results. He ensured we can start radio training for people to be in rural areas and access education. So funding has to be multidimensional. Funding has to be so. The sad issue so far is the weakness in support in technical and in higher education. We require higher education to get the teachers we want in the basic education sector. We require the skilled personnel for the country to grow economically. And yet the funding is not skewed towards technical and higher. So let me say that we need funds for technical education. We need to have interactive classrooms in all of these issues, so we do not have to reinvent the wheel. I have witnessed somebody that gave a paper, I think in Egypt, on Coursera and the various courses that you can access and adapt to. If that is exposed, it means we can catch up rapidly. We don't have to get all the instructors at the same time. At the tertiary level, really, we were talking about scholarships for scholars, those that are good. But you're talking about grant in aid for those that are okay, but they are not the top scholars, but they still have to access higher education. You're talking about loan schemes for people to take a loan and be able to access education, be it technical or higher education. So I would want to see, then nowadays, finally, you must be able to invest in the higher education sector for public health issues. Diagnostic laboratories have to be with our colleges such that we have the personnel you require if and whenever there would be any other pandemic. So I really want us to, just take the opportunity to say here that having been brought back from retirement, I did 11 years and I left, and after 10 years I've been brought back to this. I think it is time we look at multidisciplinary interventions. A school has to have a school health associated with it. A college has to be blended with sports, but with school health as well. And we should be able to get an interactive mode of teaching, not only person to person, but by distance education as well. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And very, very interesting. How do you, on one hand, you make more difficult the prioritization, right? Because sometimes people say, well, in a low-income setting, let's prioritize basic education, right? Because so many kids are not learning, they do have the fundamental skills. That's the most important thing. But you're saying, yes, that's important, but I need to invest in higher education at the same time. In Sierra Leone, because I need the teachers, on one hand, and also I need to have the skills that will drive the economy, that will generate the growth, that will generate the taxes, that will generate the resources in order to finance basic education. So actually, you're seeing more than the prioritization, you're seeing the complementarities, right, of the different sectors. So that's good. That's come from being in the different sides of the table, right, of having been minister of different areas. So, but thank you very much for that reflection. So let me close with the Minister of Finance of Tanzania. So, Minister Nchemba, we have heard of the roles of different players. The role of overseas development assistance, the role of philanthropy. We know that the critical role is the domestic resource mobilization at the country level. So I would like to hear your views on how these partnerships, right, all these different players can work together from a national perspective, right, in order to, at the end of the day, end up being able to fund, right, the investments that we need. How can we put together all these different players, the private sector, ODA, the national resources, in order to give our children the education they deserve?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity again. On our side, in my view, first and foremost, I think is alignment of the programs. That what the government is having as a priority, and what is the government is having as an agenda should be aligned with what the development partners are also viewing the agenda, and that one will make the matching and the complementarity to work properly. So, as on our case in Tanzania, mostly the multi-donor funds which have been coming to our country, they are in line with the development agenda of the country, the manifesto, the election manifesto, and the vision for the country. So the supplement of the funds coming from the development partners actually is in line with the efforts which had been made by the government. And what we do define in our country is that, with the exception of kids themselves, the rest, we are all privileged and we are benefiting from the sacrifices which has been made by our founding fathers and our senior brothers and fathers and mothers. So everybody, with the exception of kids themselves, has a duty to repay the sacrifice which has been made by the previous generation. So, apart from what we have been getting, as I've said, thanks to development partners, the GPE, the COICA, the CEDA, the World Bank, the IMF, but we are also, as a government, committed on setting and making funds available for developing education sector. And we are even sometimes a bit harsh on the policies we make. We bring together the private sector and the government in sponsoring education. For instance, we have those skill development levies which are directly linked with higher education and vocational training. We have again designed, even in mobile communication, we bring the funds and ring-fence them directly for developing education. And the other approach which we'll have to make sure that this partnership work is the availability of construction. Land for construction of schools being made by the government, and then funds being made available from the development partners, and then the follow-up of the proper use of the funds that they give the desired results being made by the government themselves. So we, as a Minister of Finance, we as the government, we have that role of making sure that whichever amount invested on education, being from the government or from the development partners, is bearing the results desired, so that they can attract, or they can build that confidence from the partners, that once we reserve some funds, taxpayers' money from the development partners, will really bear the results which is desired by the partnership. And that has to be the role of the government, and that is what we have been doing. And we believe this one will have multiple effect on the way forward where we are going. And now it's not only some few kids being to school. now is an access for all, that they should be in school, as we have said in the previous discussions. Thank you.
Excellent. No, thank you very much, Minister. And I think there's a lot of progress in Tanzania. We have here also in the first row, Joyce, the Minister of Education. So it's great to have the Minister of Education and the Minister of Finance, right? In the same place, working together. And as you say, I think the critical point is this alignment that you say, alignment around the national agenda, right? And how can we creatively bring resources from the different stakeholders, but aligned always around that leadership that is critical. And let me close just by saying, yes, more resources are needed in this juncture, more creativity in terms of the how to do it. I think we have heard several examples from Caitlin, from Gwen, from Sierra Leone about the different things that we can do now, today, in the short run, right, in order to implement learning recovery packages that are absolutely urgent to make sure that we save this generation. But I think that the technical constraint, right, is not the most important one. I think maybe we don't have the perfect solutions, but we have many solutions that can be implemented in the short run. I think the resources, right, are always a problem, but I think putting together the private philanthropy, ODA, and national resources, we can move. I think the critical binding constraints is the political will, right? That we see it in many players here in this in this room, but actually we need to see that political will everywhere. That real internalization that we are living a silent crisis in education. It's not that like the crisis in health that we see in our face, right? The damage that the pandemic is doing. Kind of we don't see, right, that crisis and that damage, how much these young kids have been hurt and how much their future productivity, welfare, earnings capacity of being citizens of their country is being hurt. We really need to make sure that we have an internalization of the magnitude of this crisis and have the political will in order to make a change and make sure that we don't have a lost generation. But we have a lot of ideas here. We have a lot of ideas in this room. We just need to keep on going and to implement these changes as fast as we can. Thank you very much for everyone. Thank you very much for this panel. And let's go to work.